Let's talk about wood. Barrels, specifically. We're gonna drink some Irish whiskey. So, whiskey nerd video on oak barrels, specifically oak barrels. Because what happens in the whiskey industry is that you see all these labels that see things like bourbon oak, sherry oak, port oak, and then you'll see European oak and, you know, first fill virgin oak, and there's all these terms. So first things first, when someone in Scotland says first fill, they mean the first time they've filled it. And when they say second fill, they mean the second time they've filled it, right? If it's a truly new barrel that's never held anything before, they call that virgin oak. In America, we call it new oak. Fair? Okay, now, let's talk about oak, and then we'll talk about a few other things. So, the most dominant barrel in the whiskey industry is called Quercus alba. That's the, what is it, Latin name? It's American oak. And the reason that it's most common in the whiskey industry is that American bourbon and really rye and wheat and currently malt laws require that you use a new oak barrel. And so you get a new oak barrel, you toast it, you char it, you fill it with a new make, it becomes bourbon or rye or wheat or currently malt. And then you're done with it 8, 10 years later, say. You dump it, and now you have a used barrel. You can't put anything back in that if you want to keep making bourbon. And so the big players like, you know, Jack Daniel's, Jim Beam, Maker's Mark, these guys will then sell the barrels to someone else. Usually it's whiskey producers in other countries. And so that's why you end up with Scotland and Ireland being dominated by used bourbon casks, or what they'll call first fill bourbon casks. Now, the second time they fill it, it's called, yeah, I was waiting for you to say it, second fill bourbon cask. That Quercus alba is American oak. It tends to lend this sort of like vanilla and like toasty, marshmallowy kind of a softer sweetness to whiskeys. And so you'll often find that impact really softening out barley whiskeys in Europe. Now, the second one that's most common in whiskey is called Quercus robur. And I'm, you know, this is a Texan pronouncing these words, so I don't need your comments. It's way more porous than American oak. It's slower growing. It takes longer to get to maturity to be able to cut it down and age it. And you also have to age it a little bit longer in order to get the tannins out. But it's called European oak. And it lends this sort of like dried fruit spiciness and sort of, I don't know, I mean, I'd hate to say woodiness because it's a barrel, but it is. It's a little more spicy and dry. A little more tannin forward. Now, you won't see whiskey saying Glenlivet European oak. I mean, you might, but instead what they're going to say is sherry cask, right? Because European oak dominates the wine industry. And the other interesting thing about European oak is that very often it's not charred because it comes from the wine industry. It's only toasted. And unless they've split it apart and char it, the European oak, when you age whiskey in it, gives you all the notes you would get from toasting a barrel, but none of the notes from the big heavy char that you get from the bourbon barrels. And so the extractive notes go way down, and the things that you create from toasting a barrel, those go up. Now, I'm not going to talk about the production process of the barrel in this video, or this is going to get way too long. There's some new oak that have been showing up, or some that are maybe a little more rare. One of them in America, which is really cool, is Westland's doing Quercus Garryana. And you can see the Garryana releases. I think they're on like release 7 or 8 right now. And that is single malt from Westland, aged in Garryana oak barrels. Those, according to Matt Hoffman, the head honcho at Westland, said they have to take way longer to yard age those to break down the structure enough to let them properly interact with the spirit. So he found some old wood that was like 3 to 7 years old and on a lumber yard that no one was buying, and that's what they started using at first to make all these barrels. Way more bitter and astringent otherwise. Now, There's a really rare one in Europe called Quercus petrea that you guys would probably see when someone references French limousine casks. Bryn, a French malt distillery, is making those, or using those. It's also sometimes, I think that's the Hungarian oak one. Ooh, don't quote me on that one. I just realized I didn't write that down. Anyway, and then heading to Japan, there's a whole other oak. And that one is Mongolica? Mongolica? Quercus mongolica? Except for you would know it as Mizunara, or Mongolian oak. So now we're going to talk about, and by the way, the Mongolian oak, unlike the really dryness of Gariana, is even more spicy, tannin forward, and heading all the way into what they would describe as like sandalwood kind of notes. And then you get Brazilian oak, that's a whole other thing. Okay, so we're just now starting to see that from the Amberana barrels, but that's a whole other thing. So after this, we're gonna take a sip, and then I'm gonna tell you the basic breakdown of what happens in a barrel that creates your flavor, or at least where the flavor components are coming from. And then that'll be the end of this video. I hope you like to learn a lot about barrels. This is Bushmills Red Bush. I couldn't find a ton of information that gave me really true clarity on the difference between Red Bush and Black Bush on those two lines. I think the one of them is basically a newer oak barrels, but these are first fill bourbon forward, which should double down on all the vanillins and all of the softness in a Bushmills. And sure enough, it's pastry, buttered pastry, a little bit of citrus, kind of paper thin vanilla frosting, maybe cream, like cream in a cream puff. All sweetness and prettiness, no weird texture, or it lives entirely in the high, shiny EQ range. Someone asked what shiny is. I would say, if you've ever tasted something that you thought felt fresh, like a citrusy or kind of zesty, like light and pretty, and then you combine it with something that has really sharp edges and it's a little brittle feeling and kind of metallic, in my brain, that's what shiny means. It means light and pretty and fresh, but with a hint of sort of metallic notes to it. And that's what I'm getting in this. I get that from like really cheap or buttercream frosting. I get that, or like generic cupcake frosting, that sort of metallic aftertaste of bitterness in the sugars. The palate, woo! Nothing in the front, nothing in the middle, and then a soft buttercream vanilla in the finish. And then it sort of whispers away. That is the softest, most simplified Irish whiskey I've maybe ever tried. I think I actually get even a little more energy from the generic Bushmills than I do this one. This is just, it's like you took that generic Bushmills and you just sanded all the front edges off of it. Yeah, it just does this whoop, bell. Nothing, 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 glide down in vanilla and sugars. Man, there's not a lot to say about this one. I think it would be great if you were doing a highball. It'd be very refreshing in the vein of sort of a Japanese highball, Japanese whiskey highball. It would be probably gate on the rocks for about 30 seconds and then you wouldn't be able to taste it anymore. Chilled, I bet it would be nice chilled. I bet that would sort of soften some of it, make it even sweeter. I'm not really enjoying this one. Like, it's not wrong. It's just really boring. But hey, it's doing exactly what it was meant to do, which is be a unbelievably easy drinker, going down almost like water. The aftertaste now is getting a little bit tangy. Okay, so you get into cellulose structure. There's 4 major components in a barrel. And this is what make oak. Everyone says, why oak? Why do you got to use oak? Why not other things? Which actually my 8-year-old son asked me one time, and it led to a 4-year-long whiskey experiment with him because he actually wanted to know. It turns out that oak is the exact right cellulose structure to be liquid tight, but not airtight. And so it holds the liquid, but it allows whatever's in it to breathe. Some of the hardwoods are too dense and they don't allow any movement of air, or not nearly enough. And Some are too loose and they just leak like a sieve. You can't get them to seal up. And so, but oak, we've discovered over hundreds and hundreds of years, is that perfect combination of liquid tight, but also lets things breathe. And you need things to breathe or the whiskey doesn't age. If you stop the breathing, the whiskey doesn't age. I say to everyone who says, why don't you just wrap a barrel to stop the angel share? Because you also stop the aging process. The cellulose structure that makes up, basically think of the cellulose structure as like the binder that holds all the chemical compounds together. It's what makes it have structure and shape, right, on a cellular level. In a barrel of oak, it's roughly half. It's like 45, 50% of the barrel is the cellulose structure that's holding all of the other things together. And then you get hemicellulose, which is different, and it represents about another fourth of the chemical structure. So between cellulose and hemicellulose, you get about 75% of the structure of oak wood, right? Now, the cellulose has almost no impact on flavor, but the hemicellulose, different story. Hemicellulose is a polymer that holds what we would call wood sugars. Now, it's not sugar that you would think of like granulated white sugar from sugar cane or something like that, but it's wood sugars. It's the wood sugars in a plant, in a tree, and it holds those things. And as it breaks down, it contributes to the sort of like soft, gentle sweetness, for lack of a better word, component to whiskey and spirits. Now, in certain category companies like WSET, they don't want you to call it sweet because there's no added sugar. But anyone that tells me whiskey isn't sweet, I just want to smack them. Not sweet compared to a spoonful of sugar, no. But does it taste sweet? Yes, absolutely. To any normal person who's interpreting that a certain way. You might get sort of a round sweetness, just generic sweetness from that as it starts to degrade and interact with the ethanol in the new make spirit. Then you've got lignans. Now, lignan is really the sweet spot that is probably the dominant player in what you think of when you think of whiskey. If you do whiskey tastings and you're talking to noobs, the first thing that they'll say is vanilla, caramel, butterscotch, in that direction typically, if they try to come up with anything. Well, that flavor, vanilla, comes from, spoiler alert, vanillins. That is a thing that's created when lignin starts to break down as spirits age. It's got two building blocks, lignans, and what are they, glycol and Syringol? Okay, we're not getting that nerdy. Anyway, but as it breaks down, it releases vanillins, and that's like the really, in wine it shows up as vanilla or cream or graham cracker. If you toast the barrel really aggressively, or you get a charred oak, then it can break it down and add this sort of like almost oaky smokiness to the vanillin sugars. And that can lead some people to interpret a smell as, oh, that's smoky, even if it's a whiskey that's not smoky, like a bourbon, right? And then last but not least, you get tannins, which everyone in Texas is bitter about, because tannins, though they represent 1 to 10% of the structure of a barrel, are where all of that deep, dark, bitter oakiness, what we call oakiness, comes from. But really important in the oxidation process as things age. But if you get over-extraction of a barrel, you almost always get over-extraction of tannins. Think of it as one of those spices that in just the right amount is perfect, but too much and it just destroys everything in the vicinity. That's tannins. And one of the things a lot of people hate about some Texas whiskeys is that the tannins are so aggressive that you have a hard time tasting other things, which I think is fair. On another video, that was a heavy lift, guys. On another video, I'll talk about how the whiskey industry in America prepares barrels versus how the whiskey industry, the wine industry, where most of Europe gets its non-bourbon barrels from, prepare their barrels. I'm really glad you're here.